I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film-loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to a film critic to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Christy Lemire, to the Real Mental podcast. Again.
So good to see you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Why don't you just remind the listeners of who you are and what you do?
I'm a longtime film critic. I've been doing it for 25 years now. I co-host a YouTube channel and a podcast called Breakfast All Day, where we do every kind of film. We do summer blockbusters and obscure art house films and documentaries and horror movies. We just reviewed Civil War yesterday, which has been very divisive among our viewers, and we love that kind of thing. So we really kind of do it all there. And I do a lot of radio, and I write for RogerEbert.com, and it's what I love. I live outside Los Angeles, and I'm married, and I have a son.
Do they like the movies as much as you do?
They do. My son is my frequent plus one for these. He's 14 now. And from his earliest days, I brought him with me to movies. Like I used to take him to Mommy and Me movies when he was an infant, where they show stuff that moms and dads want to see and the infants have to sit through it. So he's seen like Hot Tub Time Machine and Shutter Island and things a baby shouldn't see. But he went with me to see Civil War a couple nights ago, any Marvel movie, any Star Wars movie. I think he has good taste.
And you're completely objective, right?
Totally. Yeah, but my husband and I love movies, and we always have. So that was from our earliest days. That was one of our things we used to do on dates. So
this is a good thing. Mm-hmm. Well, we're talking today about the movie Poor Things, which is such an interesting movie. And I just wanted to get your impressions first before I sort of chime in on the psychological piece. So why don't you give us your thoughts about this film?
Well, I loved it, and I thought it was the best film of 2023. And so I'm delighted to be talking about it. Do you want me to describe the plot at all?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. So Emma Stone is a young woman named Bella Baxter. And when we first meet her, she looks like a grown woman, but she's acting like a toddler. And she is kind of grunting out sound and toddling around and playing with her food. And we learned that what has happened to her is this mad scientist played by Willem Dafoe has taken a baby's brain and put it in her body. And we watch her evolution and her liberation and the feminist declaration that her whole existence becomes as she moves through the world. And it also takes place in Victorian England. And she goes on this journey. She goes to Portugal. She goes to Egypt, right? Or Greece, Egypt, and sees things and learns things and figures out who she wants to be, and increasingly butts up against men who are trying to control her. And every step of the way, like her eloquence, her instincts shine through. And it is thrilling and weird as hell and dark and gorgeous. And it's very, very specific in its language, which is part of what I love. Yorgos Lanthimos directed it. He also did The Lobster and The Killing of a Sacred Deer and Dogtooth. And there's sort of a through line with all of his films, Greek auteur Yorgos Lanthimos, where I feel like he's interested in exploring the conflict that arises when people behave in totally inappropriate ways in the confines of polite society. Over and over again in this film, Bella is told that she has to do things a certain way because of polite society. In her brain, the way the language gets kind of convoluted in her brain, she's totally dismissive of that in hilarious ways. And she refers to things like, oh, because of polite, I suppose, and thinks it's just hilarious that anyone expects her to behave in a certain way. So that happens over and over again in wild and hilarious ways. In Poor Things, it's this great cast, including Mark Ruffalo, who plays this total cad of a lawyer who at first is drawn to her free-spirited nature. He fancies himself as bon vivant who doesn't play by society's rules, and he sees that wild tiger in her too, and he loves that about her. but in no time at all wants to like totally squelch that instinct. And over again, this is what happens with Poor Things. Like men are interested in her for various reasons, and then they want to dominate and control her. And she finds a way to persevere and break through and become her own person. So this just won Academy Awards for Emma Stone's performance, which is brilliant because she has to be 5 different versions of the same person, each of which is distinct at various stages of this character's development. But there has to also be this through line of consistency as to who she is and what drives her. She's great. It's technically so complicated. It also won for its hair and makeup design, production design, and costume design, all of which is very deserved because it's just so specific and wondrous and weird and gorgeous. So I love Poor Things, and you guys see it more than once because it's so dense visually, and the language is so delightful that you just won't catch it all the first time.
So I wanted to talk about a little bit the psychological aspects because I thought it was really interesting because the man who performs the surgery on Emma Stone's character is taking a woman who has committed suicide while pregnant, and then he implanted the brain of her fetus into her. So
okay, spoilers. First of all, are you putting a spoiler alert at the front of your episode?
Yes, we're going to do spoilers because cool. we have to because we have to do the spoilers if we're going to talk about the psychology.
For sure.
So,
okay.
So he is a very interesting character, I think, because he drops these little remarks through the whole movie about the things his father used to do to him. And he sort of throws them, they're like throwaway lines, right? Usually to his new helper, Max McCandles, played by Rami Youssef. And he throws out, oh yes, when my father used to, operate on me without anesthetic, or when he used to, move the stuff around on my face with a knife to see, my pain threshold or whatever. Like basically his father was experimenting on him and torturing him, and in the name, quote unquote, of science. And I see that it's not surprising that he turned into a mad scientist and he's doing all these very wild and dark experiments because he was the subject of all this trauma. And it really shows that when you're a victim of trauma, it twists you, and this guy was, he retained some kindness and compassion, but he was very twisted and his experiments were very dark. So it's a very exaggerated way of portraying trauma, but in a sense, it's a very realistic way of portraying trauma because it gives some context to why he would be doing all the wacky stuff he's doing, because he was so deeply traumatized and physically injured by his father.
That is a really fascinating way to look at it. And understandably, you look at it that way because that's your prism, that's your expertise. Yeah, I never thought about that before, but he was abused, and he's perpetuating that cycle of abuse, which is so extremely common. Yeah, you're absolutely right. He is doing it in, as you say, the name of science. He views himself as a father figure to Bella. He thinks he is protecting and nurturing her. One of the ways that he controls her is by never letting her leave the house. And when she insists on leaving the house, they go in a covered carriage and she wants to see outside and he won't let her. And so yeah, again, he's denying her the pleasures of existence, but he's telling himself that it's all for the right reasons. And then when she leaves, he does it all over again on another young woman played by Margaret Qualley, and it doesn't quite go so well. She doesn't quite, develop intellectually at the rate that Bella did, and it never really works. And you see all of the stuff in his lab that indicates years of trying and failing. I did a Q&A. I did a couple different Q&As with the Poor Things folks, but one of them was with Willem Dafoe and Emma Stone and Mark Ruffalo and Rami Youssef and the director. And Willem Dafoe was saying that the production design was so elaborate. Those books in the lab were actually books from that era. He could go over to a shelf and pick out a book and read what a scientist at that time would have read. So in this mad world, they took that seriously.
That's amazing. Well, another thing you mentioned is how her father figure was controlling her. And one of the things that I've learned as a psychiatrist is that when you impose excessive repression on anyone or any system, what you get is pushback. And so here's Bella. She's this very independent, strong-willed, free spirit, and she's being very forcefully controlled. And of course, what's she going to do? She's going to run away with the first ne'er-do-well who comes along and suggests it to her. So Mark Ruffalo is her ticket out because she can't tolerate the repression. And so, it's psychologically very true, very right on, because that's how people tend to respond to repression. They either buckle under if they're weak, like the Margaret Qualley character, or they fight and they escape, or they do their best to escape if they're, strong-willed, like Emma Stone's character.
What's so fascinating with the way that that relationship develops with Mark Ruffalo is that he's so arrogant and so assured in his own worldliness, intellectualism. But once he realizes he can't control her anymore, she's going to think for herself and she's going to go out and do what she wants to do in Lisbon of Portugal. He begins to adopt her language. I noticed that on the second viewing, that when she goes out and, eats pastries and enjoys life, he says, "Did you let him furious jump you?" So he starts using her phrasing for sex to ingratiate himself, to win her favor back. I don't know, just to make himself subservient to her in some way. So I thought that was so interesting.
Well, I think he realized that she was cooler than him. I think he thought he was the cool guy, that he was so cool, that kind of narcissistic thing,
Yeah.
right? Where they think I am so cool. And he met someone who actually was cooler. And so what a typical narcissist does when they meet someone who's cooler than them is they, on the one hand, they get enraged by them. How dare you be cooler than me? And on the other hand, they want the other person to love them because they need their approval. Because, narcissists are fundamentally very deeply insecure. So he both resented her for being cooler and also wanted to curry favor with her because she was cooler. And the whole time he had this ambivalent feeling toward her, right? He wanted her to approve of him and he resented the hell out of her because she was so much cooler. She was so much freer, right? He saw himself as, like you said, as free, right? This guy who was free from the strictures of their society, but she was so much more free than him. She was truly free and he was playing at being free. So she was cooler than him and he didn't like it.
That dance they do is like the whole movie in a microcosm in one scene, because she's out there like flailing her arms around, having the best time, letting the music truly move her. She's literally dancing like no one's watching, right? That's the cliche. She's doing it. She's letting her freak flag fly. And he is following after her and like trying to rein her in and wrap his arms around her and get her to dance to his rhythm and his steps. It's a really specific manifestation of what the whole movie is about. The patriarchy trying to control her, trying to control women, and her busting free and asserting herself over and over again.
It's true. And it shows, I think, psychologically what someone who has that kind of confidence and freedom can do when the patriarchy is trying to oppress them or repress them.
I was saying, I love too that every step of the way she meets women who become mentors to her, women who also have bucked the rules of society, whether it's the madam at the brothel in Paris or the older woman on the cruise with her traveling companion, Hannah Shigula and Gerard Carmichael. And I love the little moment between those two women where they're reading on the deck of the cruise ship, where Mark Ruffalo has like abducted her to try to control her, put her on a boat where she can't go anywhere. And they're reading and he tosses her book into the ocean. And then this woman just casually reaches over and hands her another book and she can start reading that. So then there's a prostitute at the brothel in Paris too, who shows her real genuine love.
Yes.
It's a romantic relationship. It's a sexual one, but it's pure, that connection. So I love that women along the way show her who she wants to be.
It's absolutely true. And they are not trying to control her. They're just enjoying her and appreciating her and being her friend or her lover. So they're very much seeing her, but not having a problem with it. Like you were saying, a lot of the time, a woman who is strong or free, men feel intimidated or angry or threatened, and they need to do something about it, right? And witches, right, who were burned were women they called them wise women, right? They were women of wisdom. They were often healers or midwives, and they had skills, herbalists, and they had skills. And so they were threatening. They delivered babies. They had powers, and they needed to be crushed because it was too threatening to have these women with powers and skills and who didn't need necessarily men. So this is a version of that, right? This movie. And now let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. We all need to be inspired and uplifted these days. We need a good laugh and we need to be moved. In the Ruthless Compassion podcast, I speak with a wonderfully diverse group of people. They've overcome daunting obstacles and they're making unique, exciting contributions to our communities and to our world. The Ruthless Compassion podcast is at 145 episodes and counting. Why not have a listen to it today? So I wanted to talk to you about the character, Max McCandles, because you and I had a little disagreement before we started talking about, I said I thought his character was weak and you said nope. So why don't you tell me what your thoughts are about this fellow?
I think similar to the women in the film, he loves her for who she is. He's not trying to control her. He may seem a little submissive to her, but that is perhaps in comparison to the big personalities of other men in her life, whether it's Godwin, whether it is Duncan Wedderburn. And so I feel like he is a gentle, kind force. He comes in and he's inquisitive about her and sees her evolve and loves her no matter what. Like at one point when she comes back to England after all of her European adventures, she tells him what she was charging men for at the brothel. And he's like, oh, that number is way too low. Like, so not only does he not judge her for sex work, he thinks she should be higher valued. So I don't think he's weak at all. I think he's confident enough in himself to be with somebody who is confident as well.
I totally agree with what you're saying. I think the piece that I felt was weak was that I didn't have a strong enough sense of who he was and what he wanted. So he, it felt like he was really there as a supporting character to support Willem Dafoe's character and Emma Stone's character. And maybe that was really just his role. But I would have loved to get a little bit more of a sense of who he was and what he wanted, because then I would have felt like, okay, there can be a man who has some substance and who can also be that supportive to the female character, right? Because he felt just a little bit flimsy, but maybe that's just the problem with the writing.
Maybe, he wasn't as well developed as other people, but I feel like there was a legitimate scientific curiosity that drove him. And he was interested in who she was, interested in this world. And maybe he seemed a little passive in trying to help Godwin further his scientific experiments. But like when she comes back, like he's the only one who's not threatened by her. So that speaks a lot to his integrity.
No, you're absolutely right. And she ends up with him and her female lover, but at least, he is not rejected by her as she rejected, all the other suitors because they were all trying to control her. So, she didn't have a problem with him in that way at all. I love the scene where she goes, oh, you're so cute. When he says, I'm strong or something like that. Oh, you're so cute.
It's a genuine affectionate moment, it seems.
Yes. And also it really shows that the man doesn't have to be dominant in a good relationship, right? That, there are different ways that power can exist. Different kinds of power dynamics can exist in healthy, positive male-female relationships.
For sure.
So how do you feel like in terms of the scene where the ex-husband comes along and Emma Stone's character just goes, okay, yep, I'm going to go and be with you because I'm curious to know who you are. I mean, she was tremendously curious. It's wonderful. Like she just explored things. She didn't crush her own curiosity. She followed it. So here she is. She's curious. This guy shows up. And of course, who finds the husband is the lawyer, Mark Ruffalo's character, because he wants to hurt her because he's mad at her because she left him, right?
Because he's so petty, so small.
Yeah, well, nothing we've ever seen before, right? So he brings the husband, he's not an ex-husband, the husband, and Emma Stone goes to him. What do you think of that piece of the film?
I think it's so clear to her soon after she arrives why it is that she wanted to fling herself off of a bridge. She was miserable. It's Victorian England. She can't get divorced. She's clearly part of the aristocracy. If she married this man who was he's like a military officer, I want to say, and she clearly comes from wealth, and there were expectations in society for women at that time, and so she was expected to probably bred to be someone's wife. That's probably her entire raison d'etre, was to have the right marriage and live the right society life and make babies and procreate and perpetuate this lineage. And so I think she'd rather, like, that spark was already in her, before she had the opportunity to reinvent herself. Clearly the spark was already in her, but she knew she wanted something more, but her options were limited as a woman of the aristocracy at that time. She'd rather die than be with this awful, abusive man. And so even despite the lush trappings, he's a brute. And she realizes pretty fast, like, I want no part of this. So I think it's consistent with who we know her to be.
But then he plots not to kill her. He plots to mutilate her, right?
To mutilate her.
Remember, he's got the doctor there and they're talking about mutilating her, genital mutilation. They have this
Oh,
device. Did you catch that?
I don't remember that part.
Yeah, he is talking with the doctor and she's walking down the hall and she overhears them, and they're
Oh,
going to the next day the doctor's coming and they're going to put ether on her. Actually, that night they have the glass of
no.
liquor with ether in it. They're going to drug her and then they're going to mutilate her
Yes.
to make her submissive, right? Because in
Mhm.
those days they thought that, our uterus or our private parts were the things that made us crazy, and that if we were, if we had a hysterectomy, we'd no longer be hysterical, or if they did genital mutilation on us and we couldn't have sexual pleasure, then we would no longer be out of control.
Yeah, no, I do remember that, and that's why she's learned enough about science herself from all the time in the lab she's had everywhere, that she knows how to take control of that situation and, you know, do what she does at the end when she makes her own kind of destiny there, yeah.
But I thought that her courage, I mean, he's holding a pistol to her and he's basically saying, drink the doped drink and, everything's going to be okay. And she just walks right up to him with a gun into her head. So she has this, it's not even courage. It's almost like, what would you call it? It's more than courage, right?
It's like her purpose is so clear, like there's no question as to what she wants from life, and it just is. Like it's just such a given that this is who she is and what her drive is about. So I mean, it's brave in that she's still a woman in this society, but she's a maverick and a trailblazer. Mhm,
Determination. I think that's what I was
mhm.
thinking too, right? And you were saying
Yeah.
that something similar. Yeah. So she's got this determination and she just like she walks right up to him and then splashes the beverage in his face and he goes down instead. So
Mm.
so she prevails. But like she is such an inspiring figure, don't you think, as a woman for
Oh,
young
yeah.
girls
Oh, for
even?
sure. Oh, yeah. In that she dares to think for herself. I have so much hope for young women now that they are confident enough in themselves and have like the language to express who they are and who they want to be in ways that like I didn't growing up as a teenager in the 80s. So I'm hopeful that, a lot of the stuff that forms you when you're young and impressionable doesn't necessarily exist, or if it does exist, that people have the wherewithal to push through and figure out how they want to live their lives. So yeah, I think that it's a great example. When I talked to Emma Stone for these couple of Q&As I did with her, she said this is her favorite character she's ever played. That she just fell in love with her immediately because of that strength, because of that fearlessness.
Very often I think we watch movies because we want to live through the characters, right? We want to have like a vicarious
Mhm,
experience. Like we were talking earlier about a book I was reading and this
mhm,
character who was doing some interesting stuff and you're going, yeah, sounds interesting kind of thing. It's like
mhm,
we get to imagine ourselves doing the things that they're doing. And of course, a lot of the things that the characters in this film are doing, we would never do. But to have some of that courage, to have some of that freedom, to have some of that recognition that we don't have to follow the rules those ways and be oppressed in order to be okay. I think that's
mhm.
very, very inspiring and very, in terms of the psychology, very true as well, because that's what a lot of therapists teach us, right? It's almost like a therapy lesson without a therapy lesson.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes from her sexual liberation. And there's been a point that people have discussed once Poor Things sort of expanded wider into more theaters beyond New York and LA. That became the thing that everyone wanted to talk about. Oh, it's shockingly graphically sexual. And she is naked a lot and she has sex with a lot of people and learns what she likes and what she doesn't. And I think that's totally crucial to her journey. And it's how she asserts her femininity and asserts her identity and asserts her power. And even when she goes to work in the brothel, I've talked to male critics about this, and they've thought that that was so uncomfortable and how it objectifies her so much. And it's like, no, she's a total pragmatist. She says, I need money and I like sex. So here's a perfect place for me. And so I thought that was bold as well. And I believe that Emma Stone, as a producer on this film, was really keen to explore that side of this character with no judgment. I think that's a really important part of how she evolves.
Well, and it's so interesting because again, it's like when women's sexuality is owned by men, they can have pornography up the wazoo and it's fine. It's
Mhm,
not uncomfortable at all. But when you see a woman who's making the choice, I think she actually said, I want money and I want sex, right?
uh-huh,
Like she
right.
wants sex and she wants to have lots of sex with lots of people and really explore it. She has no shame. She has no inhibitions. She's perfectly comfortable with her body, with her sexuality. And so when she is having a good time and completely shameless, that is uncomfortable to some people, right? And I think that's a very interesting thing psychologically, because we are so taught to be ashamed of our sexuality, of our sexual desires, of our sexual kinks, of whatever, right? We are taught that they're bad, they're wrong, our sexuality is wrong, and women should not be overtly sexual. We should be sex objects for sure. We should be, viewed. We should be held by the gaze of those who want to gaze upon us, and we should present ourselves in a way that's pleasing to the gaze of those who want to gaze upon us. But for us to just say, I am happily sexual in my own body and enjoying myself and I want it, that's something that's uncomfortable. And I think that says more about the audience members than about the character.
For sure. And the sex scenes aren't sexy in a traditional way. They're not like erotic in a way that you see in films. They're kind of perfunctory. They're kind of just an activity, like eating a pastry or, walking around and looking at people on the sidewalk. Like, it's just part of her existence. Is how she's learning about the world. So it's not there to titillate. It's there to illuminate, I think, instead.
Yeah. And I think the sex scenes that were fun were kind of fun. And the sex scenes that were kind of work were kind of work. And when she was enjoying herself, it was kind of fun to watch. And when she wasn't enjoying herself, it was kind of sad. But it was very much about the emotional part, right? The sex scenes really, to me, related very much more to what she was experiencing on a feeling level in each different scene.
And the rare one that was tender and loving was with the young woman at the brothel, her fellow prostitute, the young Black woman in the brothel, who, like, that was an expression of like tender intimacy that is not anywhere else in the film.
Right. So that was more making love as opposed to having sex.
Yeah.
Which is another thing she was exploring.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it all forms her and makes her the woman that she becomes.
Yeah. So I can see how other critics or other people would be uncomfortable by all the sexuality, but I think it just shows how much people are uncomfortable with women being sexual. And I see so much, I don't know about you, but I see so much in the media of women, saying I own my sexuality, but I really see them as portraying themselves as sex objects as opposed to confidently sexual, because it's still what the male gaze likes, right? It's still what the producers like, what the directors like, what the male audience likes. I don't see it as what Emma Stone's character is doing, right? Really owning their sexuality and saying, this is what I want, this is what I'm going to do. It still feels like they're paying lip service, but they're more like sex objects rather than fully sexual, free beings.
Right. It's a traditional image of what femininity is expected to look like. But even before she goes to Lisbon or Paris, once she discovers masturbation, that also is like the key to the whole film. When she says, Bella can make self happy whenever she wants. That is it. That is the whole movie right there. And that discovery is something that, like, we can all learn from. Like, you can make yourself happy whenever you want in whatever form that takes. And you don't need a man to help you determine what that means. And so I think it's a very simple statement, but it's profound in this context.
So in a sense, we can really say it's a very feminist film.
Totally.
And that might be another reason why it makes some people uncomfortable.
Totally. Older men in particular are like, there's a lot of sex in it. She's being objectified. I'm like, is she though?
No, if you were watching porn, you would not feel that way. And that's where they really are being objectified. So yeah, it's very interesting. It's okay for these guys to watch porn, tons of porn, where the women are completely objects. But when a woman is confident and strong and wants something, then suddenly it's uncomfortable because it's much more real and it's something that's possible in the real world. And that's very, I think, uncomfortable for some people to imagine somebody actually being that free and that empowered sexually. What would it mean for them?
That they'd be meaningless. They wouldn't have as much power, right? That's scary for them.
Yeah, exactly. They wouldn't have as much power. Exactly. This is a woman who had power. And I think that's another reason why Mark Ruffalo wanted to punish her, because she was free and she had power and he couldn't control her and he couldn't get her to love him, like just fawn all over him and feed his ego. And so he had to punish her. And I think, a lot of narcissistic people need to punish the other when they don't do those things.
She has power, but she also has empathy. That's also part of the instinct that develops within her just naturally. And so when she sees people suffering, She's moved deeply by it. When she sees that her husband is abusive toward the serving woman at their castle, she's appalled by it. And so there's a kindness that lurks within her. She doesn't wield her power in a cruel way. She uses it for good.
Yeah, and to me, that's true power. True power is not
Mhm.
power over, it's power to.
Mhm.
So yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. Well, it's been so much fun talking to you about
Mhm.
this movie. Do you have any final thoughts about this movie you want to share before we wrap up?
I would say if you're thinking about seeing it, if it's playing in a theater near you still, please do. I know it's playing on Hulu here in the United States, which is, I think, Disney Plus for you guys in Canada. Stick with it because it's kind of weird off the top. My husband, who loves movies and loves weird movies, in the first 10 minutes, he was like, this might be too weird for me. And then he stuck with it. And he's so glad he did and he loved it. And so I would say stick with this for a little while because the score is intentionally off kilter and there's like fisheye lenses and the language is really weird, but it falls into a rhythm and it all evolves and the costume design evolves and the score evolves until she reaches her most eloquent, full, complete state. And then it's just rapturous. It's just a symphony. So stick with it, I would say, because it just gets phenomenal.
Yeah, it's a real celebration of woman, kind
Mm.
of wrapped up in the guise of a slightly horror film.
Yep, a Frankenstein film
Yeah.
with puff sleeves.
Yes, with great wardrobe. Yeah.
I love the clothes. Everything she wears is so great. And when I interviewed her, she was saying that the wedding dress that you see her wear is her favorite of all the costumes. It's the most beautiful piece of clothing she's ever seen. So that costume designer won an Oscar over the Barbie costume designer who recreated every single Barbie dress perfectly. There was something truly original and wild about these clothes, and so it won the Oscar.
Well, I think everyone was inspired by the story. It was such a wild and original story. So
Mhm.
I can't wait to see what Lanthimos has up his sleeve next.
Well, he's got a movie coming out in, I think, a couple of months with Emma Stone. In June, I want to say. It's later on this year called Kinds of Kindness. And Emma Stone and Willem Dafoe are both in that as well. And what it's about is being kept under wraps. But they've worked together 3 or 4 times now. She was also in The Favorite for him. And so they're sort of on their own, a cool wavelength. So I look forward to their next film too.
Fun. Well, thank you so much, Christy Lemire, for coming on the Real Mental podcast. It's really been fun talking about this wonderful film and getting your very astute insights into it.
Thank you. I love talking to you about movies. So I'm always happy to come on back. So thank you for asking me.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. While you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 140 episodes and counting? And if you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening!